Good evening and welcome to Behind the Headlines. Today is Wednesday the 20th of July 2022, and in this programme tonight we're going to be discussing Joe Biden's historic visit, or not historic visit, to Israel, the Palestinian Authority and Saudi Arabia, his first official visit as US President to the Middle East, and we'll be unpacking some of the reasons why he went, what some of the objectives of what he and his administration wanting to achieve, and has he left the region a safer place. Reagan, it's great to be doing a programme with you, and I know that we've survived a heat wave, 40 degrees.
I notice you're still suffering from some residual heat.
Absolutely. I thought it feels like beach. Yeah, I did. Yeah, I'm not wearing flip-flops though.
It's good. I love the shirt. It's great.
Thank you.
A nice twist on Hawaiian. I think though it's more Italian. I see Sicily on the road trip. It's cool. It's cool.
I know. Well, it gets some attention anyway.
Yeah.
But what do you make of Joe Biden's first visit to Israel as US president? Because I know last week when we were getting ready to record Behind Headlines, I was watching Air Force One fly into Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv, and all the pomp and ceremony and how jubilated, I would say, the Israelis were, particularly Yair Lapid, the new Prime Minister, at the prospect of Joe Biden visiting Israel as US President for the first time.
Well, okay, first time, significant, but let's be honest, a bit of a non-event in many ways. In basically, nothing really of significance is accomplished. Also, what we see is there's this ongoing deal that the U.S. is trying to make with Iran that could jeopardize Israel, that will jeopardize Israel. They're, bizarrely against Russia in one conflict, but arguably working with and through Russia in relation to Iran. And so this was a good opportunity for Biden to give assurances, to mend some fences, to hopefully shore up a little bit of support, but I don't think he succeeded in doing any of that.
Not at all. So just a reminder, we are live, we are interactive tonight. So our big question for tonight's programme is President Biden endangering Israel? Now, the pretext to why the Israeli leaders, particularly Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett, we know that their government has collapsed, but we know that Yair Lapid is the new acting caretaker Prime Minister in Israel until the 5th round of general elections scheduled for the 1st of November, was the fact that he wanted to put the Iran issue, which is the Iranian nuclear issue, at the center of discussions between Israel and the United States, knowing that there's even been discussion now that the Iranian regime have said that they are now beyond the point of no return in terms of their development of nuclear weapons, and time is running out, and it looks very certainty that Yair Lapid has not got that support from President Biden to say, look, if Iran doesn't stop enriching uranium to 60% of where they are now, then what we could see is that Israel or America could actually carry out airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. Now, I think that would have definitely happened under President Trump, but under Biden, it's a totally different thing altogether.
Well, Yair Lapid has specifically expressed to the president, to President Biden, that Israel categorically opposes, without any equivocation, this nuclear deal. So President Biden is fully aware of the significance of continuing with this deal. He's fully aware of the damage this will do to the relationship between Israel and the U.S., which is supposed to be a relationship of trust and of mutual building, really. But not only have we seen President Biden just continue to plow ahead with this nuclear deal, we've also seen, while in Israel, this is his first visit to Israel. He has a wonderful opportunity to show we support you. We will continue to stand with you against those who advocate, support, or involved or supported by terrorist organizations. He takes the opportunity to meet the leader of the Palestinian Authority, not in Ramallah, but in East Jerusalem.
The Mount of Olives.
The Mount of Olives. He chooses to meet this active enemy of the Israeli state in Jerusalem. And this puts, again, the division of Jerusalem back onto the table for discussion. In many ways, it's a slap in the face of anyone who is in favor of Israel, but particularly the Israeli government. It's incredibly disrespectful. It did nothing to resolve things in any diplomatic way. Okay, fair enough. He could have gone to Ramallah. He could have visited. They could have had a discussion. That's fine. That's okay. But to actually go to East Jerusalem, to say, yeah, you come here to East Jerusalem. Biden is making a political statement there, and it will not sit well with the relationship from the Israeli side.
I think Yair Lapid, because he's the new Prime Minister and because he's a progressive left of centre, I think he felt that because his ideology was very similar to that of the Democrats, and the state of Israel has known Joe Biden since he was a senator back in the 70s and consider him a friend. They actually thought that they would have a lot in common and they would be able to reach out. But what it shows really is the kind of duplicity that President Biden has said his support, and he said on Israeli television that he's a Zionist, he supports the state of Israel, but his actions say another thing. So should we just highlight now some of the good highlights of his trip before we start to go into why this was a complete disaster, not only for Israel but also for America and also for America's allies in the Middle East, traditional allies in the Middle East, I should say. So said Joe Biden's trip here was an unprecedented opportunity to change the dynamics in the Middle East. One senior Israeli official told reporters last Tuesday, a day before the US president landed at Ben Gurion Airport. The superlatives from the Israeli leaders continued after Biden had touched down, with the Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid called the visit historic. And President Isaac Herzog took a rhetorical step further, likening Biden to the biblical Joseph on a journey of peace from Israel to Saudi Arabia, from the Holy Land to the Hijaz. There's many people you could describe in the Bible, but I don't think Biden's a Joseph. Might share the same first name, but that's as far as it goes.
Shocking.
We also see that this did not stop as Israeli leaders from doing everything they could to inflate the magnitude of this visit in Israel itself. For example, Lapid and Biden signed the Jerusalem Declaration, which we've got an extract of that declaration, during the trip, in which senior Israeli officials told journalists this represented an historic statement that shows the unique nature of what of what we are between our two countries. Lapid even had the document framed on Sunday and hung it up himself in the cabinet meeting room. Do you want to go on and see what President?
Oh yeah, so President Herzog, he granted President Biden a Presidential Medal of Honor. This was the same.
What?
I mean, it's. This is the question for what. He has supported Israel in the past, but I mean, we can look then at what's happened on this trip and ask the question, well, is he a deserving recipient of it? This was the same decoration that was bestowed upon the Czech president only a few days before, and they said that his acceptance speech was warm and heartfelt. The extended conversation on one knee that Biden had with two Holocaust survivors at Yad Vashem returned him to his younger political persona, who, by all indicators, was a tactile, caring man with an ability to connect with the public. And this is how, in 2008, certainly, as there was the presidential election that eventually saw Barack Obama elected, Biden was by far the most preferable of the Democratic candidates. At the time, he was the most pro-life of the Democratic candidates. He was the most pro-Israel of the Democratic candidates. And it wouldn't have been an absolute nightmare in people's minds if Biden had been elected as president at that time. Now, whether or not it's Obama's influence on Biden over the years, or whether or not it's external pressure, the Biden that people remember from the younger years, certainly seems to have morphed into a different one who is not always carrying his wits about him, and certainly doesn't seem deserving of this Presidential Medal of Honor.
No, absolutely. And considering what President Trump, I'm not getting into party politics, the difference between the Republicans and the Democrats, but what President Trump did in his 4 years office for Israel was absolutely extraordinary. And we see here that, for example, it took Joe Biden almost a month to pick up the call and actually speak to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which thankfully I got a chance to actually meet him yesterday in central London.
Have you fist bumped each other?
Yeah, I fist bumped Bibi.
Yeah, very cool.
I did have a little bit of a conversation with him, but not much. And the Israeli ambassador was there, his former deputy foreign minister in Zippy Hotoveli. Was there as well, so that was thanks to Magen David Adom. So it was nice, and it was great to be in a room with a great statesman such as Bibi. But sadly, he didn't give us any insights into this, his thoughts on Iran or his thoughts on the up and coming election. So I can't actually share anything like really exciting that he actually shared. But I think he was just endorsing the work of MDA.
Now let's look at this joint declaration.
Yeah,
that was signed. It's pretty important. The leaders of the United States and Israel, President Biden and Prime Minister Lapid, met in Jerusalem on the 14th of July, and they adopted the following joint declaration on the U.S.-Israel strategic partnership. The United States and Israel reaffirm the unbreakable bonds between our two countries and the enduring commitment of the United States to Israel's security. Our countries further reaffirm that the strategic U.S.-Israel partnership is based on a bedrock of shared values, shared interest, and true friendship. Furthermore, the United States and Israel affirm that among the values the countries share is an unwavering commitment to democracy, the rule of law, and the calling of Tikkun Olam, repairing the world. The leaders express appreciation to former Prime Minister Bennett, who led the most diverse government in Israel's history and under whose leadership the extraordinary partnership has continued to grow stronger.
Even though the government's collapsed.
Exactly. The government collapsed. It was an abysmal failure. And one has to ask, okay, we know, Simon, that there's a lot of political word, there's a lot of stuff that goes out in statements that's not really showing the reality of what's going on. This speaks of shared values. It speaks of the commitment of the United States to Israel's security. Oh, okay, so have they pulled out the Iran nuclear deal? Have they met with the Palestinian Authority on their own territory in Ramallah, or have they acknowledged some presence in Jerusalem? These are actions that the U.S. has undertaken that are actually threatening Israel's security. So regardless of whatever the statement is made, you can't just say something without backing it up in action.
Of course.
But it goes on.
And that's carry on.
It goes consistent with the long-standing security relationship between the United States and Israel and the unshakable U.S. commitment to Israel's security. Really emphasizing that, and especially to the maintenance of its qualitative military edge, the United States reiterates its steadfast commitment to preserve and strengthen Israel's capability to deter its enemies and to defend itself by itself against any threat or combination of threats. The United States further reiterates that these commitments are bipartisan and sacrosanct, and that they are not only moral commitments but also strategic commitments that are vitally important to the national security of the United States itself. It repeats itself time and time again, but it's just empty words.
This was actually produced by the White House. It's on their website if you want to see it.
Yeah.
Just a reminder that we are live and interactive tonight. We'd love to know your views and your comments. Has US President Joe Biden endangered Israel? And we'll cover more of that as we go through the program. What was also surprised about this one as well is that we have the rhetoric, and we've got extracts of the memorandum of support between the United States and Israel, known as the Jerusalem Declaration. But really, we see that the policies are completely at odds. I mean, it was Biden who's decided to refund UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, that is perpetually keeping the Palestinians in a perpetual state of statelessness, as it were. This is the only UN agency that has millions and millions of taxpayers' money around the world pumped into it to keep them alive and not to actually resettle them. And that money would be better spent looking after the Syrian refugees, with the false premise that those Palestinians who claimed that they were kicked out of their land when the modern state of Israel was declared in 1948 after the War of Independence could return to Israel proper, to their homes. Now, we have to fact that there has been a massive population transfer during the years from 1947 all the way up until about 1952, where over 700,000 Jewish people from Arab lands were forced out of their homes. They had to leave up their homes, their businesses, that they've been there since biblical times, going back to the first exile when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem and the first temple. And many of them resided in other places around the Middle East, particularly Iraq. They were just told, all you can do is just take your own hand luggage and go. So, you know, this whole concept of then looking at the conflict as it was over 72 years ago and saying this is fine, I mean, that's an abomination for Israel. We also see that, for example, Joe Biden, as well, as you said, actually met with the leader of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmood Abbas, not in Ramallah, but in Jerusalem.
Right.
And on the Mount of Olives. And there wasn't one single Israeli delegation that was able to go. That Biden actually took the Israeli flag off his own limousine and put a Palestinian flag on it. No Israeli journalists were allowed to be there at the press briefing, where he iterated his support for the Palestinian cause and compared himself as an Irish American and identified with the Palestinians, saying, I know what it's like because I'm an Irish American and the Irish have been oppressed by the British for over 400 years. So, I mean, that's not diplomatic protocol.
No.
And not only damaging relations with Israel, but also damage with Britain, which is another one of America's strongest allies.
Such a bizarre thing to say. There's a complete abdication of any diplomacy in Biden's discourse. And so when we observe, you know, we have to ask the question, okay, in the past year, we've seen so many signs that Biden has been struggling, that in his health, in his speech, and various ways, there are indicators that this man is not the best individual to be the president of the United States, and it's certainly not someone that you would necessarily trust going into a very high-level, important meeting that affects the security of multiple countries. We are live, we are interactive. Please do be sending in your thoughts regarding Biden's visit to Israel. This is the first visit of President Biden to Israel since his presidency. So Susan has sent in an email. I think President Biden has literally snubbed his nose at Israel by meeting on the Mount of Olives with Palestinians. He is speaking in actions and not doublespeak to show that he does not want Israel to retain all of Jerusalem. I wonder who is pulling the string behind Biden as his failing mentality is beginning to crack. Who is in the background and who is the danger? I'm not necessarily convinced that there is anyone particularly pulling Biden's strings. I think this is a man who's been let loose, who is incredibly unwise in what he's saying, because if someone is pulling the strings, they're doing a very good job of endangering a lot more people and alienating a lot more people than they would have to. There's smarter ways of going about, doing dangerous stuff. And Biden is not, especially in his comments, there.
Yeah, but isn't he effectively, de facto, recognising Jerusalem, and particularly East Jerusalem, and East Jerusalem cannot be divided from West Jerusalem. I mean, it's a functioning city, it's a multicultural city, it's a beautiful city. Jerusalem is my favourite city in the world, and I love to be in Jerusalem. I love to see those city walls and go to the old city, and just enjoy the kind of vibrancy that there is there. But we know that Jerusalem cannot be divided, and yet this is what Biden is wanting to do. He's effectively recognising a de facto situation where he sees East Jerusalem as being a capital for a future Palestinian state. He even declared his support for a two-state solution, even though we know that the Palestinian Authority and its leadership don't want a two-state solution. They want to see the destruction of Israel, and will use anything in terms of their phase plan of I think it's in the late 1960s, their phase plan to take Israel stage by stage. This is really troubling because this endangers Israel's security. There's only one people that have ever been identified with Jerusalem, and that's the Jewish people, going back to biblical times.
The statement says that the United States stresses integral to this pledge is the commitment never to allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon, and that it is prepared to use all elements of its national power to ensure that outcome, which is a very interesting thing to say, given that Iran is, as we've said even several months ago, it is on the cusp of having access to a nuclear weapon. President Biden and the United States seem to be quite confident that this isn't going to happen. They're speaking in very strong terms. On Sunday, Fox News played two short clips, one of Biden and the other of Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid, each speaking about how to stop Iran. So this is in that context. Biden said diplomacy could work. Now, Simon, when have we seen diplomacy in the Iran situation work? We're talking about a group that just a couple of years ago, when we saw the assassination of one of their primary leaders, an active terrorist, the whole parliament stood up and joined in unison chanting, "Death to America, death to America."
Yeah, General Soleimani.
General Qasem Soleimani, when he was assassinated, they all started shouting out "Death to America" in the parliament. It was televised. You can access the clips. I'm sure they're even on YouTube. So diplomacy could work, Biden says. "I continue to believe that diplomacy is the best way to achieve this outcome," is the exact quote. Lapid pushed back and emphasized, rightly, that words will not stop them, Mr. President. Diplomacy will not stop them. This should be patently obvious, especially to the leader of the United States, don't you think, Simon?
Absolutely, but he's got no authority though, because if you don't back up your words with force, your words have no power and authority, and that's exactly what we've seen with Biden, whether it's the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, whether it's the disastrous US withdrawal from Afghanistan last August, or whether it now comes to the Iranians being so close to developing their own nuclear weapons. If you do not back up your rhetoric with force, you have no power. And this is exactly what the Iranian regime is able to see. I mean, according to Caroline Glick, and she writes some excellent articles in the Jewish News Syndicate, she said that Biden's envoy for Iran, Robert Malley, and we've done a program on this subject before on Behind Headlines, says effectively told America's allies during an interview with NPR on the 5th of July that the administration had betrayed them. Malley said that Iran already had sufficient qualities of enriched uranium to assemble a nuclear bomb in a few weeks. He says that Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt and Bahrain wanted to hear from Biden how the United States intends to block Iran from becoming a nuclear-armed state. Now that his envoy has confirmed that thanks to Biden's policies, Iran has reached that nuclear threshold, which is scary. So instead of outlining such a policy, what was Biden's response? Biden's response was to tell Israel and the Arabs that the United States is staying the course with a nuclear appeasement.
Remarkable. We have from Amanda in Belfast. Just to put Biden straight, here on the Shankill Road, we are not being oppressed by the British. We are British.
Oh yeah, you only have to go to Shankill Road to see that, with the pictures of the Queen, people wearing Glasgow Rangers football shirts, British flags everywhere. Yeah, you can't get anywhere more British in the British Isles than in the Protestant areas of Northern Ireland.
And so again, you know, Biden saying what he said regarding how he is fully aware of oppression to the Palestinians, admitting and acknowledging, I mean, this is something that he's doing. We can look at it in a couple of angles here. He is saying, you are oppressed. You're right to feel oppressed. You're right to feel the victim in this situation. You're right to be offended. I know what it's like to be oppressed because for 400 years the British have oppressed my people, the Irish. It's a strange thing, very undiplomatic, very dangerous across many fronts. And yes, it has rightly irked Amanda from Northern Ireland.
Excellent. Let's have a look at this excellent CBN news item. Sadly, this one is not with Chris Mitchell, who's the bureau chief in Jerusalem. But this really does talk about Joe Biden calling for a Palestinian state and actually meeting with Palestinian leaders, not in Ramallah, which is the center for the Palestinian Authority, but Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives under Israeli sovereignty.
The Palestinian people deserve a state of their own that's independent, sovereign, viable, and contiguous.
Along with reiterating support for a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the president pledged more aid money to the Palestinian Authority, seeking to repair relations after the Trump administration cut ties.
Today, I'm announcing the United States is going to provide an additional $200 million to the UNRWA so it can continue its vital work of helping the most vulnerable Palestinians, especially Palestinian children.
An additional $100 million will go to the East Jerusalem Hospital Network. What has been a larger focus on this trip is Biden's meeting with Saudi leaders, including Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who Biden previously promised to make pay after U.S. intelligence concluded the prince was responsible for the death of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
My position on Khashoggi has been so clear. If anyone doesn't understand it in Saudi Arabia or anywhere else, then they haven't been around for a while.
With high gas prices here at home, the president is likely looking to increase oil flow from the region back to the U.S. But he says the visit is also imperative when it comes to promoting stability in the Middle East.
The reason I'm going to Saudi Arabia, though, is much broader, is to promote U.S. interest. Promote U.S. interest in a way that I think we have an opportunity to reassert what I think we've made a mistake of walking away from, our influence in the Middle East.
With the United States of America distances ourselves from other people and other countries that should be stronger friends and stronger allies, they go elsewhere. And when they go elsewhere, there aren't other good friendly countries that are waiting with open arms. Saudi has an enormous amount of resources. They are an attractive prize on the world stage. So whether it's China or Russia or others, that's where they're going to run to. And therefore, it behooves us to hug them closely and to enhance the relationship with them, even if we've got challenges in that relationship. To distance them is only going to propel them towards our enemies and our foes.
Biden's flight from Israel into Saudi Arabia was actually historic in itself. It's the first time a U.S. president has been able to take that direct flight. Saudi Arabia now granting flyover rights to Israel.
Well, thank you for that report to CBN. We have some more emails here. Hi, Simon and Reagan. Thanks for covering the sham of a visit to Israel by Biden. In his actions and statements, he has betrayed Israel whilst issuing a statement of supposed support for Israel. The whole visit was full of double standards, and he has shot himself in the foot. Russia and China must be laughing at this inept performance by the supposed leader of the free world. That's from Ken in Ayrshire. Ian says, thank God Churchill knew what he was dealing with. Rick says, greetings from Isle of Wight. Thanks, great show. I saw on Israeli news just now that Iran can make a bomb. Is this true? And Israel will not stand for that? What is the truth and what are the lies to make Israel strike first?
Well, I believe that they do have the nuclear weapon. I think they have developed it. The only difference is they haven't tested it. So for every nation that has nuclear weapons, they've got to test the bomb first. Once they test the bomb, There's no going back. And so therefore there is only a very limited time space that probably Israel has got in order to take out Iranian nukes to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear powered state. And trust me, if we think the situation is awful in the Ukraine now, just wait till Iran has nuclear weapons. We are going to see an escalation in terrorism around the world, and the regime itself will be able to protect itself with nuclear weapons. We will also see the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the Middle East, the most dangerous region in the world, which makes it more likely that nuclear material will end up in the hands of a terrorist organization. And we're going to see a major nuclear terror attack in one of our major cities, be it London, be it New York, be it Paris or anywhere else around the world. And this is the greatest danger to peace and security in the world. And this has happened on Joe Biden's watch, and he's failed badly. So, this is very scary. But look, this is the comment that he made at the Mount of Olives. I mean, considering the Mount of Olives, according to Scripture, we know that this is the place that Yeshua HaMashiach is going to stand. He's going to come back, and that panoramic view of Jerusalem, of the old city, is just incredible. This is what he said. He said, "My background and the background of my family is Irish American, and we have a long history, not fundamentally unlike the Palestinian people with Great Britain, and their attitude towards Irish Catholics over the years for 400 years. So effectively, he's saying that Israel is a colonial power, was clearly prepared because he also quoted an Irish poem. He says the idea that Israel is a harsh colonial overlord is in someone else's land is the essence of being anti-Zionist. He has the false claim that the Jews have no history in their historic homeland, no national rights as an indigenous people in the land of Israel, and is inherent to their narrative." Now, he also gave $100 million US dollars to the East Jerusalem Hospital and approved US funding for UNRWA. He also damaged relations with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates as well. So he's not only endangered Israel, he's endangered the Arab Sunni states that make up what is known as the Abraham Accords. There was discussions about how Saudi Arabia were going to normalize ties with Israel, but he's completely scuppered that and destroyed that by not being tough and coming against Iran's regime. So earlier today, I recorded a special interview. So this is from a journalistic perspective on the heart of what was going on regarding Joe Biden's visit to Israel and the Middle East. On Biden Headlines by Chris Mitchell, who is the bureau chief for CBN in Jerusalem and host of Jerusalem Dateline. Chris, it's always a pleasure to see you, my friend. How are you? And you've had an extremely busy week with President Biden visiting Israel and the Middle East. Share with our viewers your very busy week reporting on Biden's first official visit to Israel as US president.
Well, great to be with you again, Simon. It was a busy week last week. It began on Wednesday afternoon and it ended early, I should say mid-afternoon here, Israel time, on Friday. And then he was, President Biden was on his way to Saudi Arabia. Here, it was an interesting trip. I guess on the surface, a lot of pomp and circumstance and a lot of very cordial, even effusive give and take between, say, Prime Minister Yair Lapid, President Isaac Herzog, and President Joe Biden. For example, they gave President Biden, the Presidential Medal of Honor here in Israel. He spent time at Yad Vashem, honoring the memory of those who died in the Holocaust. He actually met with a couple of Holocaust survivors. That was kind of warm moment. But there was some concern about some of the issues that he did. I would point two major ones would be the concern about Iran's nuclear program. He did say that the United States will not allow Iran to get a nuclear device, but he says that the main way to do that is diplomacy. Now, there was a press conference between both President Biden and Yair Lapid, and Yair Lapid made the point there has to be a credible military option on the table against Iran's nuclear program. And I think that really is a contrast between the US and Israeli positions concerning a nuclear Iran. One other issue was on Friday morning when President Biden went to a place in Eastern Jerusalem the Augusta Victoria Hospital made a donation of $100 million to hospitals under the Palestinian Authority. But the concern was that it was kind of a de facto recognition of that part of Jerusalem as a future capital of a Palestinian state. Symbolically, they took off the Israeli flag when the presidential motorcade went up there. And some people think that was symbolism, but it really cut to the root that maybe the U.S. position now, as opposed to the Trump administration, sees that part of Jerusalem as the capital of a future Palestinian state.
So Chris, what do you make of the joint declaration for US-Israel strategic partnership? Is it just grandstanding, or is there actually some depth and context and contents to this new agreement?
Well, it may depend on who you ask. I know that today in the Jerusalem Post, Ambassador Tom Nides really was glowing about the Jerusalem Declaration. Somebody described it as sort of the renewal of marriage vows between the U.S. and Israel. It certainly was really the rhetoric was quite effusive for both the relationship. They talked about the memorandum of understanding that would be 10 years of military aid, $38 billion to the U.S., an extra $1 billion of replenishing of the Iron Dome interceptors because of the war last May of 2021 between Israel and Hamas. But actually, other people said it was really a nothing burger. It's not that anything hasn't been said before, any understandings that hadn't been reiterated before. They said the Biden administration felt this was the centerpiece of President Biden's visit here to Israel, but it really just reiterated pretty much what the U.S. and Israel relationship has been for many years.
And Chris, how did this go down, do you think, with the Israeli public, but also back home for you in the States with the American public?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I think with the Israeli public, they appreciate any time a U.S. president can come here to Israel. They want to make sure that they maintain that really historic and deep bond between Israel, the Jewish state, and the United States of America. I'll just give you an anecdote. You know, my neighbor was very pleased that Biden was here, and yet I think on another level, many people thought, President Biden maybe have undermined some of the security of the Jewish state by going to Bethlehem, meeting with President Mahmoud Abbas, giving $200 million to UNRWA, a UN organization that many people see as indoctrinating another generation to eliminate Israel, and also recognizing President Abbas, who really actually supports terrorism, for example, the pay to slay policy of the Palestinian Authority that pays families of convicted terrorists for years and years. On the home front, I think that was the Israel trip was one element, but I think maybe more importantly for the U.S. was the trip to Saudi Arabia, where basically President Biden went gas can in hand to try to get the Saudis to produce more oil. He didn't get exactly what he wanted, and I think it might. I think in the U.S., because of the high inflation, the high price of gas, I think that was something they don't think he came home and delivered to the U.S. public.
And Chris, you talked earlier about the Iranian regime coming so close to nuclear breakout, and of course, this is the most pressing issue. And also a point of contention between the United States and Israel under the Biden administration. Now, we know, for example, you've done excellent news reports covering the mock military operations that Israel's carried out this summer for a potential strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. Do you think that with Yair Lapid, the new Israeli prime minister, that he's able to bring Biden on side and bring on the Americans on side to back Israel in the event of any potential airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities? Or do you think that Israel will now have to go alone with the Biden administration?
Well, Simon, I think it's a hard sell to have Yair Lapid actually convince President Biden to go ahead and have the U.S. join or actually lead in a military strike against Iran's nuclear program. I think they're all in on the diplomacy and the even though the talks have gone on for months and months with no resolution. In fact, if they actually were decided, these rules or regulations in the agreement would expire very quickly, and actually maybe many people think put Iran on the path to get a nuclear weapon. So I'm not sure Yair Lapid can do that. It would be a hard sell even for Benjamin Netanyahu. I think right now that it looks like Yair Lapid and the current government, which is a caretaker government until November 1st, when there'll be new elections, it's going to be hard for them, I think, to go it alone. But given the vulnerable status of the government itself, it really is a caretaker government right now. Having said that, the IDF chief of staff said the other day that it is the moral obligation of Israel, and as he said, a national security commandment that they prepare to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. If it really comes down to it, perhaps Israel will go ahead and go it alone against Iran and its nuclear program, which, as they admit, they can get a nuclear device if they so choose. They're at 60% enriched uranium. They can go to 90% weapons grade uranium, probably within a matter of days if they decide to. And then I guess people would say game on to see what Israel would do in that case. It may take time to weaponize that uranium and miniaturize it, put it on a warhead and a ballistic missile. But I would think that's Israel is watching this as close as it can because it is an existential threat to the Jewish state.
And Chris, what do you make of the news story today about how President Putin is wanting to meet the Iranian leaders to discuss a defense pact and a military alliance against the West? How troubling is that as a signal of a threat to not only Israel's security, but also to Western security as well?
I think it's a grave threat to Israeli security to have Russia and Iran in this kind of a joint economic and military pact. I think it's extremely troubling. It also has an impact in the region, Simon. Even just yesterday or the day before, the UAE announced it may be sending an ambassador to Tehran. Saudi Arabia said that there would be no sort of regional infrastructure against a regional power, meaning Iran. So what I kind of see, Simon, is the weakness of the U.S. is being felt here in the region, and nations like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, maybe Bahrain, they're seeing what's happening and they want to protect themselves. They're looking out for their own interest and maybe getting back to siding back with Iran, seeing that they right now may be the strong horse in the region, and they don't want to have their own nation vulnerable or threatened by a potential nuclear Iran. I think it's very troubling development, and why people need to be praying for Israel, for the peace of Jerusalem, and for the whole region.
Amen. Do you also think that President Biden has come to the realization, or maybe his team on foreign affairs has come to the realization that the Abrahams are an actual success and to actually embrace them, as we were expecting that there would be an announcement possibly on diplomatic and normalization of ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel, but seems that that's been put on ice, or for the moment anyway. But is there a realization that the Abrahams Accords are the future, and that he should follow President Trump's line on what he did on the Middle East?
I think to a certain extent, Simon, that they see a value in the Abraham Accords. They were hoping for some sort of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. There was one symbolic gesture that the plane that he took from Tel Aviv to Jeddah was perhaps one of the first official flights from Israel to Saudi Arabia. But actually, the Saudis downplayed that, and they said, well, we're just opening up to all commercial flights. So I think they don't have the kind of robust sort of headwind or tailwind behind the Abraham Accords that the Trump administration would have had. We did speak to one leader in the one of these Gulf countries on background. He didn't want to be quoted, but he did say, you know, if the Trump administration had been in power, had been reelected, there would have been many other nations that would have come aboard the Abraham Accords. I think they would have seen the U.S. as a strong ally in the region. And in contrast, I don't think they see the Biden administration as really committed to the region. And I think that they don't see a strong U.S. Backing Israel and them against a potential nuclear Iran and allied with Russia.
And finally, Chris, how can our viewers be praying for Israel and the Jewish people right now, considering that you are in the heart of Israel, based in Jerusalem?
I would say pray for wisdom for the leaders, for Yair Lapid, for Defense Minister Benny Gantz, that they know what to do, for IDF Chief Kohavi. They have massive, historic, history-changing decisions to make, even as an interim government. So I would pray for wisdom for them. And perhaps there would be some unity as well, to pray for unity. There has been a lot of divisiveness, a lot of division within the political system here and many of the personalities. I would say pray for unity. In Psalm 139, it says, the Lord commands a blessing when people are united like that. So, and also pray for the peace of Jerusalem, as it says in Psalm 122, and pray the people that pray that and love Jerusalem, they will prosper. So I think those are a couple of prayer requests. And also pray for the U.S. leadership, for President Biden and his security team, his national security team and foreign policy team. And if there's any sort of ways that they need to course correct, that the Lord would lead them, just as it says in Proverbs that the heart of a king is like a stream in the hand of the Lord, and he can move it wherever he wills.
Amen. And of course, our viewers need to pray for you and your team in Jerusalem as well, because you're doing a fantastic job. And of course, your program, Jerusalem Dateline, is aired on Revelation TV. So please keep up the excellent work that you and your team are doing there, Chris. And we really value your excellent news reports, bringing the truth about Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. Really value it. Thank you so much.
Great to be with you, Simon. Thank you.
Pleasure. God bless. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you to Simon and Chris Mitchell for that very helpful interview there. We are, again, live and interactive. If you have any final thoughts on this, please send them in. We have from in, thank you for your such an interesting and informative program and all your hard work. Bless you. We also have from Gordon, an ex-Shankill Road resident, that the Americans cannot talk about oppression as they have oppressed the indigenous Native Americans for hundreds of years, stealing their lands, putting them in useless land and reservations, as well as lack of food. You go on to talk a little bit more about that, and there's a point that can be made in regard to that. But unfortunately, in this situation, Simon, I think this is a diplomatic disaster, not only when it comes to Israel, but Biden has successfully made a hash of things with UAE as well.
Absolutely. So according to this, the Saudis expected the US to shift its position, both on Iran and about the criticism of the Saudi government over the Shkologi affair. Radir also signalled a willingness to turn over a new leaf in US-Saudi relationship by increasing oil production and moving to establish deeper public relations with Israel. It says that Biden had one central goal, and that was to temper the global energy crisis through increasing production in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Morgan Azag, an expert on the Gulf region at the Metavim Institute, says everything outside of that, in my view, was a sort of decoration, an effort to divert attention to other places that suit the Bidenist policy on liberalisation, on peace, on rights of Palestinians. He says here that the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates are furious over the attempts by US Secretary of State Blinken to force the PLO and Jordan into the most sensitive Abraham Accords forums in all its facets, including defence and investment, which has caused the Saudis to walk back from what they were willing to do in terms of normalisation with Israel.
And as Ehud Yair, the Arab affairs correspondent for Israel's Channel 12, noted, this U.S. effort is a severe blow because it would allow the PLO, which is committed to undermining the Abraham Accords, to serve as a spoiler, which this U.S. policy will essentially allow. Even the UAE, the jewel in the Abraham Accords crown for Israel, put on a telling message during the visit, saying the UAE is not part of any axis against Iran, said Presidential Advisor Anwar Gargash, adding that Abu Dhabi is considering returning its ambassador to Tehran. The same spirit has been evident across the Gulf in recent months as Arab countries cope with the reduced U.S. presence in the region by de-escalating with Iran. So what we're actually seeing, these Abraham Accords, which we were looking at as being very, very good developments in many ways in the Middle East, being rubbished as a result of Biden, arguably.
Okay, let's have a look policies. At this. This is the direct response of President Biden's visit to Israel, to visit the leaders of the Palestinian Authority in Jerusalem, and also to Saudi Arabia, was a response that they responded by giving President Putin a state visit to Tehran, in which they strengthened ties between Russia, Iran, and Turkey. And despite the fact that Turkey is a member of NATO, this is very, very alarming. And what we're really beginning to see is that kind of formation of that Ezekiel 38 and 39 armies coming together. So instead of actually bringing peace and stability, Biden has in effect empowered the Iranians, and they've now embraced President Putin, who is supposed to be the Democrats and Biden's number one enemy.
Yeah, it's deplorable. Deplorable. We have one final email. This is from John, who is from County Louth and Ireland. He says, great program, and subject as always. Regarding Biden's Ireland comment, I live right on the border of the Republic and Northern Ireland, and as such, I saw the peace process going from not happening to time for peace. Major difference with here in Israel is that Israel's enemy does not want peace, which is true. We've talked about that. We were ready for peace here after long years of senseless killings, etc. The Gaza and Judea and Samaria all do not want peace, just annihilation of the Jewish state and the Jews.
Absolutely. So in terms of US foreign policy, this is another absolute disaster. He was hoping that the Saudis would pump more oil and therefore alleviate the energy crisis the world is facing. Didn't happen. He was hoping to strengthen ties with Israel. That didn't happen. Palestinian Authority leaders, Mahmood Abbas and others, may have got UNRWA refunded with $200 million US dollars, but did that change anything in relations with Israel? No. Has he improved relations with Saudi Arabia? No. The United Arab Emirates? No. And it very much feels that he's actually empowered the enemies of Israel and the West. So all in all, everything he touches seems to be an absolute disaster zone.
While simultaneously seeing what could very well be the rubbishing of the Abraham Accords, which were significant developments. I mean, it's absolute calamity. But Simon, at the end of the day, we have to recognize is God is sovereign. He's in control of all of this. Our hope isn't in what Biden messes up or succeeds in not messing up. Our hope is in the God of Israel, who will keep his people safe, who's coming again. Our hope is in that beautiful promise that whatever happens on the Mount of Olives right now, whatever undiplomatic events, our Lord Jesus Christ, the prophet Zechariah says, will stand his very feet on the Mount of Olives. It's been good to have you join us this evening. Next week, Simon and I will be back for more from Behind the Headlines. We ask that you would continue to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, pray for our leaders, our authorities, and ask that God would give much wisdom and that there would be much grace. God bless you all. Have a wonderful evening. We'll see you next week.